I like to throw this in there, because this is, where I came from, in a different era. Obviously, Steve and Taylor, we're from a little bit closer to this era than Noah is. So, and a lot of probably the PT students and trainers and people that are going to be seeing some of these presentations as we go along. So, the funny part is it's so true, right? This is like, the life of a young kid during the 80s, just battered and bruised and still out there on the bike, going, woo, it's time to go, right? So I just like including that slide. All right, so like based upon that slide, right, as an 80s kid that beat myself up and was battered and bruised, and you know I was in the emergency room more than I probably wasn't when I was a kid. Literally, I remember there was a string where I went to the emergency room like almost every month for stitches or a broken bone or something. For a certain age period that I went through, I had a lot of injuries, a lot of non-related sports injuries. And it's interesting because when I try to think back to what everything that happened to me, a lot of it wasn't in like some big sports moment where I got hurt. It was on the playground, just playing backyard sports. I got hurt a lot of times, a lot of ankle sprains. I broke my wrist twice, and that 80s picture always reminds me of my childhood. But so basic rundown on me here, right? I graduated in exercise science at Gannon in 03, got my DPT in 06. I did my residency in 06. I was in Cincinnati till the end of 08. I finished my research in 08. I got the residency program with the University of Cincinnati credentialed through the American Physical Therapy Association while I was doing my research and doing my residency, which was a really cool experience to be actually to create the curriculum for a high level residency program like that. Was pretty awesome. And right around that time was when I started getting involved with the sports lab, in particular the sports science lab. And I had talked about this before. My research was on understanding the foot and ankle mechanics relative to the lower extremity mechanics, especially in ACL tears in female athletes, right? So it was a perfect segue for me to get involved with the sports science lab, sports lab, Marinovich, and start working on the program that they had. It was very heavily based in neuromuscular conditioning, neuromuscular strengthening, and just the neuromuscular philosophy, PNF and all of those things that we've talked about. And it also had this big barefoot component, right? So I had all these foot and ankle problems. Basically the research that I was doing was showing that foot and ankle issues, were highly related to all the bad biomechanics of the body and the injuries that we were seeing. So I was like, all right, let's take this a step further and get into this program that, was, very, foot centric, foot and ankle centric. That was their whole idea, was to put the foot and the ankle first, because it was your foundation in most of your athletic positions and activities. You're going to put your foot on the ground first, right? I had also had another clinician that kind of mentored me in my last part of my PT school, who was a foot and ankle specialist. And I always joke he was the type of guy that basically would look at your foot and ankle if you had a shoulder or a neck problem, right? You'd come in and complain about your shoulder, and he's looking at your feet. So I was an intern, or whatever you want to call it, a PT student under him, my last clinical rotation at Hammett Sports Medicine in Erie. So, these things were kind of accumulating and pushing me in that direction. So then in 2010, I started Revolution Physical Therapy in Cranberry. And basically right at that time, at this time was when the sports lab and sports science lab and everything was starting to crumble. The whole system and everything that was going on was just so fragmented and all over the place. And as somebody that was involved in the program, you could feel it, but you couldn't understand what was going on. And basically at this time, it was hard to find anything on YouTube. You couldn't look anything up on Wikipedia. You didn't know the history behind this thing. And, even now, I just met another guy that was involved with Marinovich in the sports lab a couple of weeks ago, and he was still telling me new stories about the truth of what happened, right? So the challenge with this was, it was right at the time where I was getting ready to open my practice, right? And this whole thing was crumbling, and I'm trying to figure out how to incorporate what I was learning into the business practices that we were using, but I didn't really have a good resource to actually fulfill that. So I ended up having to create a lot of things because this whole thing was falling apart at that time. And Nick Curson with Speed of Sport was also, kind of becoming the new guy with this, at least in the mainstream and in the kind of the limelight. He was working with all these high level MMA, UFC fighters. And so he had kind of taken it and really, pushed it even further towards, more of the sports training. But on my end, I'm looking at it and going, well, this program really works for physical therapy. It really works for everybody. I know that it's great for high level athletes, but how do we get this so we can take this program and get it to everybody, right? Can we have a neuromuscular based strength and conditioning program in the community, in a retail setting that allows anybody to get access to it, whether they're a high level athlete or not?
What's going on in that picture?
Which picture? This picture? Okay, yeah. So in this picture, right, this is kind of highlighting the idea of the FMS, the functional movement screening. So this is called the Y balance test, which, I put this picture up here. I'm glad you asked that, because at this time, through the late 90s and the early 2000s was when all of these programs really started to kind of come to fruition. And they were, these innovations off of the science that had now become these commercialized, marketed programs, right? And on my end, I was learning everything the hard way. Like, we learned about Y balance before Y balance was really, a mainstream, thing for strength and conditioning coaches and physical therapists, because I was in this really high level program, everything was on the cutting edge. And I was also at a Division I university and working with professional athletes. We were doing the best of the best of the best, right? So basically, in this picture, you stand on one foot and you push these sliders along to see how far you can reach. And you test side to side and compare it to norms as well. And basically, you can use it as an exercise or you can use it as a test. But again, the point of putting this picture here was kind of showing, basically that these programs came along after I was already, really learning this stuff longhand, which I'm glad that they've come along, because we've gotten way more exposure, especially when, these talks are designed to be bridging the gap between physical therapy and chiropractic and fitness and wellness and all of these things. So these programs like the functional movement screening, or these systems like the functional movement screening or functional movement systems, have come along and really pushed us more in that direction, giving everybody the resources and the language that they need to describe these things that we see functionally, right? And their whole idea was that you can't have all these clinicians running around not having the same language when we're talking about movement, and particularly functional movement. It wasn't really their main goal. I don't know if it wasn't their main goal. I don't know exactly what their goals were, but they really, their main agenda. And if you look at, you listen to what they talked about, they were really just trying to create a language so everybody would be able to speak on the same things with the same language. So does that make sense, Taylor?